So today's speaker is Dustin Chacón. Dustin's an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics at UC Santa Cruz. He got his PhD at the University of Maryland. He was a faculty fellow at NYU. He was also at the Neuroscience Language Lab, NYU Abu Dhabi. He was an assistant professor of linguistics at the University of Minnesota. And his last position before here was assistant professor, Department of Linguistics, University of Georgia. And he arrived at Santa Cruz in 2024. And I added that up. Dustin's had about 4 times as many jobs in 10 years I've had my whole life.
Hopefully no more than that. Yeah.
So Justin's a neurolinguist and psycholinguist that specializes in syntactic processing, grammar parser relations, language variation, language acquisition, and South Asian languages. And you'll hear some of that today. Apart from linguistics, he passes his time reading, writing, doing nerd things that he didn't list, taking photos, playing the harp, and picking up after his cats. So today, Dustin will talk about parts of a whole, how the brain processes words and phrases in reading.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for the introduction. So I want to get started. I want to start by making kind of a general point about why I like being a linguist. One of the things I really value about being a linguist is that there are many different ways to be a linguist, or there's many different ways to approach language. You can study it from a historical perspective, sociological perspective, and from the perspective of a philosopher or an artist. But since the early 1960s, American linguistics, at least, has been very focused on the question of how does language work in the mind? So we're trying to ultimately unify with cognitive science, psychological sciences, and the brain sciences. But even then, there's many different ways to study language in the mind. We can either study language on its own terms and try to come up with explicit models of how language works and hope we can slot that into the mind, or we can start from the perspective of cognitive psychology by using experimental paradigms that measure button presses and reading times and try to reason about how language works from that perspective, or we can start from neuroanatomy, right? We can look at brain imaging and start from there. And depending on where you start, you might come to different conclusions about how language works. And that's what I'm going to be talking a bit about today. And I have to say, this also tracks kind of my own personal trajectory. I started as a theoretical linguist. I spoke to a few of you, but when I was an undergraduate student, I was full in on theoretical linguistics. I still love theoretical linguistics, but my mother had a brain surgery. She's fine. But after her brain surgery, she was unable to speak for a few months. And that really brought home to me it made it very visceral to me that language really is something that lives in between our ears and things can go wrong with it. And that really motivated me to start studying this from the brain perspective. And so I'm going to show you an example of one of the cases where we have slightly different views of how language works, depending on where you start. And then I'm going to present some experiments that I won't really give you a full answer to the question, but I'm going to make some suggestions, some innuendos, and some gestures about how things might work. Okay. So I want to start with a almost self-evidently, obviously true fact about language that's really hard to imagine an alternative for. Okay, it's hard to imagine how else things could work. And that claim is that language consists of basically 2 parts. There are things that we have memorized and stored in long-term memory that we might call words. And then there's some procedures or some recipes for building more complex expressions from those words, right? So in English, we have words like cat and orange and silly, but then we also have some rules for composing those words together to make some more complex expression. So this is one of those 2 cats that was mentioned earlier. This one here is Ollie. You'll see him a few times. And these are very different kinds of knowledge, right? So Words tend to be atomic, right? The word cat doesn't have parts to it. There's not a part of the word cat that means whiskers and a part that means tail or something like that. Cat is just a unit of the language. It's open-ended, meaning that there's lots of different words that you can learn. If you've studied another language, you know one of the hardest parts is learning a whole bunch of words. You can buy word-a-day calendars and learn new words every day for the rest of your life. Word meanings are arbitrary. Again, different languages will call the same thing different labels, and so that's something you have to memorize. And again, these are stored in long-term memory. Grammar, by contrast, sentence structures are complex. There are parts to them. We tend to think of sentences as kind of a finite system, meaning that there's a small set of rules that generate infinite numbers of expressions. And so we rarely forget the rules of our language, even though we might forget words, let's say. The meanings of sentences are compositional, meaning that words have meanings and then we glue them together to get a meaning of an expression, of a whole expression. And we also sometimes think of this as a procedural knowledge, meaning it's a, like I said before, it's a recipe or it's an algorithm we can deploy to produce and understand new sentences. And again, it's hard to imagine what the alternative could be. This almost seems self-evidently true, as I said before. And if we want to study language processing, this difference is pretty fundamental. The way that we study language from using the tools from cognitive psychology and the conclusions that we've drawn about these two knowledge systems are also pretty distinct. So what do I mean by that? So for instance, if I want to study how the mind processes words, the traditional way to do that is to have people read single words in isolation, and we tell our participants to push a button if you recognize that as a word of your English, of your language. So if you see cat in vat and in zat, you would say yes, yes, no, right? And then we can measure people's response times to button presses and see which variables affect their speed at recognizing those words. And so maybe this is not so surprising, but we might find that longer words are harder to recognize, more frequent words are more quickly recognized, and so on. And then from this kind of technique, we've developed these complex models of how people store and represent words. And the basic idea is that words are the lexicon, so the mental dictionary, right? The list of words that you happen to know in your language is not a list. It's actually a very dense network where when you see a word like cat, you also are thinking of dog and meow and fur and all of the other words that are associated with that word. And you also have some competition. So when you think of the word cat, you have to tell yourself the word was cat, it wasn't coat or cut or vat. So words that have properties that are similar in form compete with each other. Now, I'll bring this up again later on in the talk, but the point I want to make here is that our knowledge of words is a complex set of knowledge. There's a dense network, and when we recognize a word, we do so in a parallel fashion, right? So when you see the letters CAT, you are at once activating the word cat. You're competing. The word cat competes with words like coat and cut and vat, and all of this is kind of happening at once. So this is just the bullet point saying what I just said. Visual word recognition processes are parallel. We have competition between different words, and this is a complex operation where lots of factors seem to matter. When we process sentences, or when we theorize about how people process sentences, we usually use techniques that are very different. So a very kind of traditional technique for studying sentence processing is we have people read sentences word by word, and then we measure their reaction times or their brain responses at each of those words. So this is called a garden path sentence. If you hear a sentence like, I found the cat silly, you might feel a little kind of buzz in the back of your head where at the word silly. So the idea here is that when you hear a sentence like, I found the cat silly, at first you think this is a sentence like, I found the cat, right? The cat was lost. Hey, I found the cat. I know where the cat is now. But the actual meaning of the sentence is something like, I considered the cat to be silly, right? So you didn't find the cat, you are expressing your opinion about the cat being silly. And so the idea is that when you encounter that word silly, you realize that you made a mistake in your interpretation of the sentence and you have to revise. And so from a psycholinguistics perspective, when we're studying language from the cognitive psychology hat on, we might then be interested in the difference in reaction times at that word silly compared to a control condition. So the picture I'm painting here is that the way that people process sentences and the way that we study the way people process sentences assumes that everything has to be done word by word, And it assumes this kind of serial processing. It assumes something happens first, and then something happens second, and then something happens third, in this very orderly fashion. Different theories will emphasize different aspects, but generally speaking, we don't have this idea of a dense network of competing representations that we have to select between. Yeah. And so again, this is a pretty important distinction for how we study language processing and also our theories of how language processing works. And there's also some arguments sorry, I don't want to say and, I want to say but. There are some distinctions, or there's some arguments that this boundary between words on one hand and grammatical system on the other is maybe not a very sharply drawn boundary. And so there are words that you can understand because they have parts to them. In other words, you might have never heard the word unrizziness before. For those of you who are familiar with the slang term riz, this is a shortening of the word charisma that Gen Alpha really likes to use. So if you have riz, that means you're a charismatic person. And I encountered this word in real life the other day, unrizziness, right? So someone had unrizziness, meaning a lack of riz, a lack of charisma. So if you know what riz means, you can understand this expression because you know what un means, e, and nis, and you understand how those parts go together. Another example, this is kind of an extreme example. This is from a Letterboxd review. This is a social media website where people can review movies. And someone gave this review to Fellini's 8.5. And the review reads, "Men will literally do this instead of going to therapy-ass film." Okay. So this is the adjective ass construction, long ass film, boring ass film, where ass is an intensifier. But instead of having an adjective, they hold a whole sentence that they slotted into that slot. When you look at other languages, you see less kind of tongue-in-cheek examples of this. But when you look at other languages, you see that words have grammar inside of them as well. And there really isn't a sharp delineation between the words that you know and then the grammatical expressions. We also know that some expressions have to be stored in long-term memory. So if you hear an expression like kick the bucket, this is called an idiom chunk, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're hitting a bucket with your foot, right? So when you hear an expression like that, kick the bucket, you've stored in your long-term memory the fact that that expression means to pass on, right? So even though that expression has parts to it, its meaning is not actually composed of its parts, and we have to store this in some kind of long-term memory store, even though it also has grammatical structure. And lastly, this is a more subtle point, I think, and this is maybe less of a well-understood point, but this idea that meanings of expressions are composed of their parts seems 99% true, but there are also some kind of fuzzy edges here as well. This is an example from a professor of mine from the past, Paul Petrosky, which is that the meaning of color adjectives can vary in exactly what they mean depending on the noun that they co-occur with. So everyone knows what the word red means, I assume, right? But if I use the expression red paint, that requires that the paint is red throughout the medium. But if I say something like red car, the car has to be red on the exterior, but not necessarily on the interior. Right? If I give you a bucket of paint and it's red on the outside but blue on the inside, you're going to be a little annoyed with me, right? But it's not necessarily the reverse for cars, right? So if the car is, black leather on the inside, then that's not such a big deal. And of course, if you have red hair, then your hair is orange, right? It's not red at all, in fact. And so that kind of suggests that even though we all pretty much know what the word red means, it has slightly different shades of meaning depending on the structure it gets inserted into. Okay, so that shows that from a theoretical linguistics perspective, from the purpose of describing language on its own terms, we see that there's still kind of this distinction, but there's kind of a fuzzy boundary, right? And so this is the boundary that I'm interested in. And I'm interested in this because in the cognitive neurosciences, this boundary doesn't seem to exist really at all. There really doesn't seem to be a piece of brain tissue that does sentences versus a piece of brain tissue that does words. That does not seem to occur anywhere. I won't go through the details of this in the interest of time, but there's already some papers that have made this point. So this is an experiment from Corey Shane, a professor at Stanford University, where they measured brain activity while people read sentences that are normal sentences. They have grammatical structure, and they also have real words inside of them. And they compared those brain responses to real words that are jumbled up, so they have no grammatical structure, versus sentences where you take all the words that have meaning and you slot in made-up words, right? So the words themselves don't have any meaning by themselves, but they still have that structure, that kind of ghost of a structure. versus those made up words that are scrambled. And the conclusion is that no matter where you look in the brain, if you see more activity for recognizing real words, you also see more activity for structure and vice versa. So it's really hard to tease these two ideas apart. You have words on one hand, structure on the other, but neuroanatomy, there really doesn't seem to be much difference. This is just another point that makes the same thing here and also gives you similar pictures of my cats. This is a study that looks at people with brain damage. The brain image on the left, if you have damage in the red splotches, you will struggle to recognize the meaning of words. So if I say point to the picture of the cat, you might struggle to distinguish between a cat and a dog. The parts that are highlighted in green, these are areas where people struggle with what we call non-canonical sentences. For our purposes, you can just think of this as sentences that are kind of complex. So something like the neuron is hugged by the cat. This is my cat Sniffle, and he's holding a stuffed neuron, if you can't see that. So in order to understand the sentence, you have to understand that the neuron is the thing being hugged. And if you have damage in one of these green areas, you struggle with this, right? So you struggle to distinguish between the neuron hugging the cat or the cat hugging the neuron. But the important point is the yellow. The yellow is the overlap. And so what we see here is that, again, although there's like little bits of tissue that might specialize, there's also a ton of overlap. And so the question here is, well, what do we do with this fact? What do we do with these two different facts where we have, from the cognitive psychology perspective, a very firm boundary between how we study words and sentences versus the neuroanatomy, where we don't really have a firm boundary, versus theoretical linguistics, where we have kind of a fuzzy boundary, but a boundary nonetheless, right? And so that's what I mean by kind of contradictory conclusions depending on your starting point. So I'm going to present on two experiments today. Before I talk about those experiments, I want to introduce the methods that I'm going to be using, right? So I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page about what I'm presenting. And so so this is me and the two devices that I use. On top here, this is MEG, magnetoencephalography. I'm just going to call it MEG because I will mispronounce that if I try to say it again. And the bottom, this is electroencephalography, or EEG. And so these are both techniques that measure the electrical magnetic potentials generated by brain activity. So the way that the brain works, in short, right, is that cells exchange electrically charged ions with each other. That's how they communicate, and that generates electrical currents that, surprisingly, we can actually measure from outside of the head. We can actually measure this directly outside of the head. The difference between these two techniques, so both of these work by directly applying some sensors onto the head. With EEG, we paste them directly on. With MEG, they sit in this big plastic bowl thing that my head is inside of. And EEG works by directly measuring the electrical potentials themselves. MEG works by measuring the changes in the magnetic fields that are generated by the electrical potentials. The way I like to explain this to undergraduate students is, human beings are electrically conductive. This is why you shouldn't stick a knife in the outlet, let's say, right? You will get shocked. But we're not magnetic in the same way. You can't stick a refrigerator magnet on your forehead and have it stick, right? It'll fall off. And so that means that that magnetic signal will go through your skull and you can directly measure it, whereas the electrical signal is going to get smeared by the time we measure it. And so that means with MEG, we can recover where in the brain that activity is coming from, and we cannot do that so easily with EEG. So I'm just introducing these so you understand what we're talking about. We're talking about measuring brain activity directly, either through this by measuring the magnetic field changes or by measuring the electrical potential itself. The reason why, if MEG is better, the reason why people still do EEG, UCSC, by the way, has 5 different EEG labs. We are kind of a hotbed for EEG, not just in psychology, but also in the humanities, like myself, and there's other EEG labs as well. But the reason why people continue to do EEG is MEG costs about 10,000 times more, so it's a little bit more prohibitive to use. Okay. I want to say one last thing. The reason why we like these techniques, though, is that they give us a millisecond resolution. So we measure in real time what the brain is doing. And that's very important for language. Language is fast. People are very fast readers. They're fast speakers, especially when you're giving a talk and you're nervous. And the brain responses themselves are fast. So lots of things happen very quickly when you hear a word. And with things like fMRI, for instance, we can't really see what's happening moment by moment in the same way we can with EEG and MEG. So that's what I'm going to be using. I'm going to use these pictures of me to remind you which technique we're using when. Okay. So the first experiment I want to present is an experiment that I did at NYU Abu Dhabi, where I managed an MEG lab. And the point of this experiment was to try to understand how is it that you process words that are complex, words like unrisiness, right? What are the steps that we use to do this? And we build off of a model that has been kind of perfected by a senior colleague of mine, Linnea Stockhall. And the rationale here is we can measure brain activity as people read words that are real words of the language, and then we contrast different kinds of errors, and we see what point and where in the brain do we see differences, different sensitivities to these different kinds of errors. Okay, so this is the most linguistics the most like theoretical linguistics we're gonna talk about here. So a prefix like re is a very kind of interesting prefix in English. The prefix re likes to attach to verbs. So if I can say something like remake, and the meaning of remake is something like to make something a second time. And what's important here is that there has to be a something that you remade. If I repaint a house, I've already painted that house, and that same house is now going to be painted a second time. Do people have that kind of a clear intuition? Okay. So we can measure the brain activity while people read a word like remake. And then we might want to contrast that with a category error. So instead of having the verb, I stick in something like a noun. So, and again, if we have people read words and then we ask them to judge whether it's a real word or not, they're going to say read dog is not a word, right? Dog is not a verb. And so there's something wrong with the grammatical structure of that word. That's the idea. No one thinks read dog is a good word, right? That sounds kind of funny to us. Okay, good. You can always
verb sometimes.
That's true. That's actually something that's funny. So here's the thing, right? We're going to have 19, 20-year-olds read thousands of these. They're going to move pretty quickly because they want to get the experiment done. They want to get their $10 and get out of the lab. And so they're incentivized to kind of go with their first gut intuition. We can always kind of recontextualize, like, well, you can dog someone, so maybe I read dog, right? You can always kind of coerce these, the term that linguists like to use to describe this kind of phenomenon. But that takes some work, and people are not incentivized to do work in this experiment. You can incentivize them. There are ways of doing that, and we can kind of play with the results I'll show you. But for the purposes of for today, let's pretend like this is absolutely clear that it's not such a good word. Yeah. But then this is the interesting point. We can also make semantic errors. So we can attach re to verbs, so real verbs of English, but verbs that don't satisfy that requirement that there's something that the verb happened to. So re-laugh is an example of this. It sounds funny to re-laugh, right? You can't really, it could have meant to laugh a second time, but it doesn't mean that. Or there has to be something that you laughed a first time, and that's where the anomaly comes in, right? And so the argument here is that's not really a property of the grammatical structure, but it's a property of how you understand the meaning of those two parts once you glue them together. And so this kind of experiment has been conducted at MEG with English, Tagalog, with Greek, and in Slovenian and Bosnian, and Croatian, actually. And the finding is that there's a pretty systematic difference between these brain responses. You don't have to worry so much about the neuroanatomy for our purposes today, but around 200 milliseconds, there's a brain response in one area in the posterior temporal lobe that says, I don't like this category error. I don't like this word redog, right? There's something funny going on with redog. But then later on, around 400 milliseconds, that's where we observe the other effect that says, I really don't like this word re-laugh. And so those are different, right? So there's a different kind of brain response to different kinds of errors and that happen in a particular order. And so the claim that this group has made is that when we process a word like remake, there's 3 steps, at least 3 steps anyway. The first step is identifying that you have re and you have make, trying to figure out how to make a grammatical structure out of those, which happens around 200 milliseconds, and then interpret what the meaning of that expression would be or is. That happens around 400 milliseconds. Okay, and so this looks like this idea that we have units and then we input those units into some grammatical structure. So it still is compatible with this idea of 2 different systems that where one feeds the second, right, where the words are the input into your grammatical structure, but it just argues that the units are smaller than words. Okay, so that's the first point that I want to make. So we wanted to extend this paradigm to a new case. We wanted to extend this to Bengali, which is a language that I've studied for a long time. I think I joked earlier, if you don't know any Bengali, you will know 3 words after this next slide. We wanted to look at prefixes that attach to nouns, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute. So we have a prefix in Bengali, du, which I'm representing here as the prefix miss in English. And this prefix seems to imply something is negative about the word it attaches to. So chinta is the Bengali word for thought. So dushchinta is how you say anxiety in Bengali. The word ghatona, so ghatona is the Bengali word for event, and durghatona means like an accident, and specifically a car accident. So a bad event is a car accident. And then also the word shahosh, this means courage. So dushahosh means something like audacity, right? Like the bad version of courage, yeah? So you can kind of see how we take a word and then we kind of color it in a negative light by adding that prefix du. So this is very similar to this prefix in English miss. Okay, like misfortune, misdeed, and so on. And so we wanted to kind of replicate this design with noun. So we wanted to slot in adjectives to make category error. So here we have the word lomba, which means something like tall. So dur lomba would mean something, if it were a word of Bengali, it would mean something like tall in an unfortunate way. So like freakishly tall or something like that. It's not a word of Bengali because this prefix really wants to attach to nouns, as I said before. And we also can make semantic errors by slotting in a noun that's concrete. So a noun that you can like picture in your mind, you could draw a picture of, you could put on a table. We call these concrete nouns. That also sounds funny in Bengali. So this is something like dushkolom. If this were a word of Bengali, this would mean something like a bad pen. It just doesn't happen to be available as a word of Bengali. Okay, so again, I want to make the point that this is not super exotic. This is very similar to the English prefix miss. You can say things like misfortune, misdeed, misadventure, but you can't really say miss dog, miss pen, miss statue in the same way, right? If someone makes a bad statue, I wouldn't say that's a miss statue. That sounds kind of like a weird thing to say, right? We couldn't do this experiment in English though, because English miss is a little bit more permissive. We can attach it to a verb. So you can also mistake things, misunderstand things, or misconstrue things. But in Bengali, you would use a different form. You'd change the verb in a different way. So I just want to make sure that like this is really not that different from the prefix miss in English, except for one important distinction. Okay, so why is it important to look at nouns, right? Why am I talking about this, or who cares about this experiment? Well, the reason why we care about this experiment is one hypothesis is we're going to replicate exactly what I showed you before, where people first notice that category error on 200 milliseconds of one brain area, and then they notice that semantic error a little bit later on. That's a very kind of obvious prediction we might expect. But the alternative hypothesis, so the one that I'm going to try to argue a little bit more for, is maybe it won't work that way because the brain is very fast at noticing the distinction between words that describe concrete things versus abstract things. It's actually very fast at this. Even before we see evidence that you care about the frequency of a word, we see there's this kind of brain response that distinguishes between something being a description of a thing that's real, that you can touch and feel, versus something that you can't touch and feel. So I won't walk through the details here, but this is an experiment making this point that came out just last year, which is very convenient for us in writing this paper, which shows at about 250 milliseconds or so, the brain is drawing a distinction between words like pen and thought on one hand. Pen on one hand and thought on the other. And so the point here is that this experiment I'm showing you here is only looking at simple words like thought and pen. So our question is, if people are able to notice that semantic distinction so quickly, maybe those semantic errors, like when you say miss pen, are not going to be so late. Maybe people will be able to do both at the same time, right? That was kind of our hypothesis here. Just trying to keep an eye on the time. Okay. First of all, we wanted to make sure that this concreteness abstract stuff was right. So we went and found all of the words in Bengali on the internet in Bengali that we could find that have this prefix. We stripped the prefix off and we asked Bengali speakers, is this something you could imagine putting on a table, holding in your hand? Can you draw a picture? We asked those kinds of questions. And we found pretty robustly that no, the answer is no. So we asked people to rate how concrete you think these things are. And the red bar graph here is the real words. So very, very, those stems, those parts of those words are not concrete at all. And then we generated some category errors, some semantic errors, and some fillers by finding nouns that are very, very concrete, words like turtle and pen and so on. And then we added those prefixes and asked people to do this experiment where we asked them to judge whether they recognize some sequence of letters as a word or not. So we have 24 Bengali speakers. This data was collected at NYU Abu Dhabi. As I mentioned, we use a 206 channel axial gradiometer MEG. I can talk to you more about that later. And we have a couple dozen in each of these categories. And what just so you understand what we did, we took that brain activity that we measured using MEG, and then we did what's sometimes called a generalized linear model, which means that for each individual person, at each point in space and each point in time, we fit a linear model to their brain data across those 304 words. And then that linear model would give us coefficients, basically correlation, a number that the correlation basically for each of these variables at each point in space and time. And then we can look across the 24 participants to see when there is or isn't a systematic correlation. So the plots I'm going to show you are basically either the correlation between some continuous variable in the brain data, or I'm going to show you essentially the difference between two conditions, just to make clear kind of what the plots are. So the first surprise, I failed to mention this, sorry. We actually had a couple of different prefixes. And so we did find around 400 milliseconds in kind of that frontal area of the brain we expected. We did find that people were sensitive to which prefix we chose to use, but we didn't really find this evidence of people being shocked by the semantic error. So we didn't find this like re-laugh brain response like we did in English and Greek and Tagalog and Bosnian. We only found people were sensitive to which prefix we happened to choose. And so that was the first surprise. But we did find this earlier brain response for the category error. So this is that re-dog error, right? We did find a kind of when we expected and where more or less, you might have noticed we swapped hemispheres. That was a bit of a surprise. But within the hemisphere, it was kind of more or less where we expected it. We found that brain response around 250 milliseconds. So that looked the same. So the fact that people were noticing the grammatical error, the syntactic error, we found that brain response just like we had in 4 or 5 other languages, but we didn't find that semantic error. But you might recall what I showed you a few slides ago. We also see that people are very, very fast at noticing whether a term is a concrete or an abstract term in this temporal lobe area around this time. So what we did is then we took that brain area, that blob that's in blue, we took those spatial coordinates, and then we asked how correlated are our concreteness ratings that we got a few slides ago with the brain activity from that blue blob. And the answer is pretty significantly correlated. So I'm showing you again here the correlation. And if you really squint at that line, those squiggles look really similar to each other. And so this is the surprise, right? So the surprise here is the same brain area that's telling you this grammatical structure has a syntactic error inside of it is also a brain area that is tracking whether the meaning of that word is concrete or not. So this distinction here between a structure of a grammatical structure that is that takes the words as input might not quite work in this case, right? People seem to be both simultaneously in the same brain area evaluating whether some word is concrete or not, as they are also evaluating whether the grammatical structure is well formed or not. And those seem like different kinds of knowledge or different kinds of cognitive representations. But at least in this experiment, it looks like the same brain area is doing both, kind of like some other data I showed you previously. And so how this works, I cannot tell you, right? So like I said, I'm not going to give you a totally complete theory here, but again, it kind of suggests that there's something more simultaneous going on than we had expected. Yeah, okay, so I want to jump into my second study, and hopefully this will take me about 10-ish more minutes and I'll wrap up. I want to show you a second experiment where it's a little bit more radical, okay? The second experiment was trying to ask this question. Well, we always study words by having people see a single word. Maybe it has 1 part, maybe it has 10 parts, maybe it has 30 parts, but we always have people see a single word at once, and then we ask them, do you recognize this or not? That is the typical way that people study words. But we don't study sentences that way. And so we thought, what if we studied sentences that way? So this is some work that I've done with my mentor, Lena Pilkinen. We asked people, so I kind of don't like this term actually, but this is sometimes called the sentence superiority effect. This is an analogy with an old observation in psychology, which is that if you take a quick glance at a series of letters, and that series of letters happens to be a real word of your language, your recall is much higher if I ask you what was the first letter, let's say. And so the idea is that maybe there's also a sentence superiority effect. If you see a grouping of words like nurses heal wounds that happens to be a real sentence of English, maybe your recall of that will be much higher than something that isn't a real sentence like hearts, lungs, livers. And so this is the experiment that Lena Bilkinen conducted and published 2 years ago. And they did find, in fact, at around 150 milliseconds with MEG, that 150 to 200 milliseconds, the brain reliably distinguishes those sentences versus those lists of nouns. And so this kind of bothers me because it's not really clear how that would work. It's not really clear how your eyes can tell that there's grammar. I keep drawing these little tree structures so you can see their sentences, but you don't see a tree structure here. When you read, no one draws the trees for you, right? That's something that your mind has to supply. So how does that work exactly? And this seems very early in the brain. So how can you recognize the sentence if you don't even know what the words are yet, right? So again, if we think that you have words that are the input into a grammatical structure, we haven't processed the words yet. So how are you getting to the structure? This doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. So we wanted to test this, and we wanted to exploit a property of Spanish, my PhD student and I, Substresta, that took advantage of a grammatical rule of Spanish. So Spanish 101 here. In Spanish, every noun has to be marked for a gender. So every noun is either masculine or feminine, and you just have to memorize it. There's just no other way around this. Coche is a noun in Spanish that means car, and it's a masculine noun. Oh, I just realized I have an error on my slide. So coche rápido is how you say fast car in Spanish, and that ending o here tells you that the adjective is matching the gender of the noun. O is a marker for masculine, and a is a marker for feminine. So coche rápido is a grammatical expression of Spanish, but coche rápida is a gender error, right? There's like something wrong about that syntactically. But you can only tell that if you know that coche is masculine. And again, we have, so this is the error here. Sorry, I put that. Noche larga is a grammatical expression of Spanish. The a is marking feminine, and noche is feminine. So coche and noche are almost the exact same word, except for that first sound, but the point here is that you have to memorize that noche is feminine and coche is masculine, and there's really nothing else there's no other way around this, right? And so in order to evaluate whether you have a gender error, you have to retrieve from your long-term memory what the representation of that word is. That's the claim here. So we did the same experiment where we have people we flashed 2-word phrases in Spanish while we measured brain activity. I failed to mention what the experiment paradigm is this happens very quickly. And so we just ask them, you see coche rápido, then you see a blank screen, then you see another screen, and you're just asked to say whether that was the same expression or not. And so that's our way of measuring recall. And we wanted to measure that brain activity to see, are people noticing that you have this error in the gender marking on the adjective in Spanish? So again, this is done with EEG. This is done here at UC Santa Cruz. This is my PhD student Substresta's first project. We have 126 expressions like this, like coche rápido, coche rápida, and then we also have these kind of noun list as controls. And we recorded it here with a 256 channel EEG system, which again, I can talk to you about the gory technical details later. We did a similar analysis where we took the brain data and then we constructed for each subject a linear model at each point in its time and space. And then we looked across the participants to see whether those beta coefficients, the estimates, were significantly different than 0, which is a standard kind of method in neuroscience. And so what I'm showing you here, this is not yet significant. This is we have 19 subjects completed. We're expecting 25 by the time this is finished. But we see that, so I'm plotting here on this red and blue circle thing. That is the map of the sensors on the participant's head. And the little white dots correspond to where we find a significant effect in our statistics. And and then this line plot here is again showing you the difference between the grammatical sentences and those that have an error. And so what we see here is that around 400 milliseconds, let's say, people are noticing that there's an error in the gender marking of the adjective. Right, they're noticing that there's an error, right? So we see a big difference between the brain response evoked by that gender error versus the grammatical expression. And so again, we're wondering, well, how is that possible, right? So that seems very kind of bizarre that it would be that fast. How could this be happening? And well, so we took this idea of lexical competition and we thought maybe we could exploit this. So some of you already, so this is Spanish 102. If I gave you Spanish 101 a few slides ago, some nouns do tell you what their gender is by the last vowel. So some nouns most nouns that end in O in Spanish are masculine nouns, just like their adjectives, and most nouns that end in A are also feminine adjectives. So a noun like carro is a masculine noun. Coche, we don't know unless we've memorized it. But there are also exceptions. So you also have words like mano, which means hand, which is feminine. If you use a masculine adjective with mano in Spanish, people are going to look at you funny, right? It's like a very obvious error in Spanish. But the intuition is, right, when you're processing a word that's what we're going to call transparent, where that kind of wears its gender on its sleeve, a lot of the other words it's competing with are also going to end in O and are also going to be masculine. So when you think carro, you're thinking, okay, well, I'm trying to get to the word carro, which means car, but I'm also thinking jarro, which means pitcher, corro, which means circle, barro, which means mud. When you're hearing coche, you're also thinking noche, which means night, but that's feminine. But you're also thinking of other masculine terms like gache and roche and so on. And when you hear a word like mano, that word is feminine, but all of its competitors are masculine. And so our thought was maybe people are somehow leveraging this list of words that it's competing with that are kind of co-activated, and it's using that list of words to guess whether it thinks the expression is grammatical or not. And so we included this in our model, and we found in the back of the head, the same spot as we saw before, around 250, 300 milliseconds, we see a significant correlation between the number of nouns that compete with that noun, which we call a neighborhood in linguistics, that have the same gender as the noun that you're actually processing. Okay, and it's the same area, somewhere in the back of the head, and it's just a little bit before the previous finding that I showed you. And just so you can compare those side to side, it's like you're first pulling up the list of words that this word sounds similar to, and then you're able to distinguish whether that expression was grammatical or not. And sure enough, we then also wondered, well, I wonder if this effect of noticing whether the syntactic error is there or not, I wonder if that error, that signal, that brain signal, is mediated by that first signal. And so what I'm plotting for you here on the x-axis is that the gender distribution in the neighborhood, right? So how many words share the same gender as the word you're trying to process that you have to somehow distinguish between. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the difference between the brain response to that word being in a grammatical expression versus an ungrammatical expression. And for these words that are what I'm calling opaque, the words that don't clearly wear their gender marking on their sleeve, there is a marginally significant correlation. It's p.06. Again, we're still collecting data here. So that seems to suggest that how bad an expression like coche rápida sounds is predictable by how many other words coche competes with when you do this very, very fast presentation. So our idea here, and I'll kind of wrap up here, the idea here is that when people are seeing these expressions very quickly, right? So when you receive a text notification on your phone and you want to see whether you should read it carefully or not, you do a quick glance down, you're somehow both simultaneously processing the words and their meanings, and you're also processing the grammatical structure in a way that's not sequential, right? In a way that's, maybe there's a little bit of sequentiality here, but it's somehow the same process. That's kind of the idea that we're trying to say. So just to recap and to wrap up here, I'm very bad at like having good conclusions to my talks. I just kind of end suddenly. In the first experiment, we argued that when we process these complex words, so words that have internal grammatical structure, there isn't necessarily always this kind of clear timeline of different brain activities. And we might see that the same brain area that encodes information about grammatical structure is also somehow sensitive to whether that word is concrete or not, which is a semantic concept, right? Like what kind of object am I describing? And that happens around 250 milliseconds, and then something later happens on. In experiment 2, we showed you that when we ask people to process sentences in the same way we ask them to process words in our contrived experiments, right? When we use a similar kind of technique, we find that brain activity seems to look, again, kind of not that different between processing a word, meaning distinguishing that word between its competitors, and evaluating that word, whether that word is a good fit for its syntactic environment. And so that again kind of seems to suggest some kind of simultaneity or some kind of parallelism in what kinds of representations people are building. And so, well, I won't harp on this too long, but like I wanted to mention, like we have this basic distinction that no one can really deny, right? When you learn a new language, you just have to memorize some stuff, and there's no way around that. So clearly, we have to have some small pieces that we just have to memorize and store in memory. And we also can't deny that we have some recipes for building more complex expressions, but there is some fuzziness at the boundary, and it's not really clear what to do with that fuzziness. People have different ideas. And what I'm kind of playing with right now is maybe we should not think of words as the relevant unit for processing sentences, but maybe it's something like sensory experiences. So for reading, it's visual fixations. When your eye falls on a grouping of letters, that's the unit for language processing. If you're listening, maybe we have some kind of window of attention that is the input. And that might not necessarily be contiguous with grammatical structure. And the processes that are launched at that point are going to involve both grammatical structure building, but also distinguishing between lexical alternatives, meaning was that the word cat or hat or what was it? That's going to interact with also determining which structure we think we're analyzing, and also is going to interact with semantics. Now, again, this is not a theory. I have made no predictions. I'm still reading some stuff to try to make sense of this, but this is kind of what my collaborators and I are thinking about. So I think I've gone a little bit over, so I just want to say thanks, and gracias to my collaborators on these projects, Fernanda Moitra, who led the Bengali project with my colleague Linnea Stockhall, and my PhD student Subsrestha, who is running the Spanish experiment, but is part of a larger grant project with Lena Bilkinen at NYU. And with that, I will finish, and I will open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dustin.
Thank you.
Thanks for being right on time.
Oh, I am. Okay, perfect. I thought it was a little over. Okay, good. Yes.
Question about that last experiment you
Yes.
described.
Yes.
You showed 3 regressions,
Yes.
and I would have expected that having the mismarking or the exception should have been worse than the opaque.
Yeah.
You showed it being almost the same as the one
Yes.
that's correct.
This is a real puzzle, and we're really not sure what to do about this, right? So what you're suggesting is exactly what we predicted, okay? So the idea is maybe before you've completed lexical access, let's say, right? Before you've managed to remember that mano is the feminine word for hand, right? Before you've accomplished that, you're going to think, well, I sure see, where am I at my slides? Oh my gosh. I see an O, right? I see that O ending, and O usually means masculine. So I should hedge my bets, and I should guess that I should have a masculine adjective, right? What I didn't tell you about this experiment is we're doing the exact same experiment with the same individuals, but we're having the words presented word by word as well, in like the traditional fashion. And when we do that, the answer is yes, we find exactly that. But when we present them simultaneously, the answer seems to be that they're impervious to that. I don't know why that is. This is why we haven't published this paper yet. We're trying to figure out how that could possibly be the case. I really have nothing more to say beyond that. I mean, and to be clear, so using that traditional technique where we ask people to read sentences word by word, that has been done with language learners, that's been done with native speakers, and people struggle with this. Even native speakers, there'll be just like a couple extra milliseconds of reading time on the adjective if they've just read mano, because those endings don't match. So there seems to be, when we give people more time, some susceptibility to that desire to have the last vowels match, let's say, but when we don't display them one by one, that seems to go away. And that's a very kind of puzzling fact, and we're really not sure what to say about that. The fact that the opaque nouns have that correlation, that's kind of exciting for us, but exactly the point you brought up, I don't know. I wish I did. It's a really weird fact.
So it is really a factor of the experimental technique.
Yes, yeah, sorry, maybe I should have made that point more. Yeah, so we're saying like, there's something important here that we're, it's always important to remember experiments are not always ecologically valid, right? And so when let me way back. Okay, yes. So it turns out that the way you make people consume the language is going to affect what kinds of information people attend to when, right? The question now is our technique more like ecologically valid, or is the more traditional technique of having people read things word by word more ecologically valid? I don't know the answer to that. I actually think we've overstated. I think we've overstated how normal it is to read a sentence word by word. So we know from a kind of real life reading experiments where we have like eye trackers and we have people read naturally, people skip around all the time. They skip over words. They'll glance at multiple words at the same time. So people are they're very clever with how they manage their eye movements. What they do not do is go word by word in the ways that our theories of language processing presume they do, and as the experiments that we conduct force them to do. And so this is not the first time where we found that the mode of presentation seems to affect what people are sensitive to. This experiment that kind of launched this whole experimental enterprise, which I decided to not talk about a whole lot, this experiment demonstrates that when you're flashing these sentences very quickly, people don't notice grammatical errors like agreement errors. So they don't notice things like nurses cleans wounds, which in most varieties of English is going to be an error. So like there's something, people are like selectively attentive to different things depending on how we present the information. That's, yeah. So you are correct. Yes.
And you hinted at this subject in several points in your talk, most recently in your last answer.
Yeah.
Is there a difference in the way the brain processes the fragment of language when it's heard compared to when it's seen?
Yes. Yeah. So the answer to that is yes. And I really have not a ton to say about that, I'm sorry to say. So a lot of our theories of how sentence processing works frankly, they're rooted in these experimental paradigms that involve forcing people to read things word by word. One thing that we do know about speech is that people are very good at incorporating lots of different kinds of information that is not present in text. And so if we were to do this with speech, things might look a little different. But there is how do I say this? There's a feeling or an intuition that when we're hearing language, we're hearing things sound by sound, word by word, right? But it turns out the brain probably doesn't care about that so much. So you can do experiments, for instance, where you'll have someone listen to some auditory language presentation, and you can take a clip and you can reverse that clip, and people won't notice, right? So it's probably not the case that when we're hearing, we're also kind of serially hearing in a sense, where the receptive window, meaning like the unit of analysis that we're attending to when we hear, is probably bigger than that.
So there's some kind of buffer in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In fact, people have argued yes, exactly. Yeah. So I'm not an expert in this. I'm sorry to say, but now I'm starting to like read this literature and like paying attention to it in a new way because I'm kind of interested in this question. Yeah. 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 Yes.
How sensitive it is to where the electrodes are? Supposedly half the spacing between.
Yes.
To get the same answer.
Great question, actually. That's a very good question. Okay, so. Oh, sorry. Yes, yeah. So the question was, does it matter kind of what the array of the sensors are? And if you have denser spacing or kind of more sparse spacing, does that matter? The answer is probably yes, but it depends on kind of how you're doing your data analysis. So we have what it was sometimes called a high density EEG system. And there's some reasons for that. Some of the statistical analyses I do are better if you have more coverage, let's say. One of the downsides of EEG specifically is that, as I said before, biological material is in between the brain and the sensor. And so that means that electrical signal gets spread out. But that's also an advantage because it means that if we're looking for big effects, it kind of doesn't matter where the electrode is because that effect gets spread all over the head. But depending on so if you're just asking, for instance, is there a difference between two conditions, it might not matter so much where you put the electrodes. But if you're doing a little bit more sophisticated analysis technique, it might matter. So with the stuff that I do, it matters a little bit more. With MEG, it matters a lot. And the problem is MEG is very expensive, as I said before, which means there's like 200 MEGs in the world. And there's like 20 different manufacturers and no one really knows how to compare results, frankly. And so we don't really know, but we know that it matters. And we know even the orientation of the sensor matters a lot in MEG, and we don't really know how to compare. Yeah, that's a great question, actually. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Did you
not for these projects. Yes. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. So the question was CT, which computer topography. Yes, topography. I have not for this project. Yes. I'm not sure whether.
Does it slow us down if we have to picture the cat?
Ah, yes. Oh boy, I have to think about this for a second.
Question.
Sorry. Yes. So does it slow us down if we have to like imagine the cat or we have to picture the cat in our heads? I really should know the answer to that. I'm sorry to say I can't off the top of my head answer that question definitively. I know people have asked that question and I just forget what the result is. I'm sorry to say. I know that there are some experiments where they've compared kind of metaphorical uses of a word versus more literal uses of a word. And I could not tell you what the result is. I'm so sorry. Yes, it's a great question though. I should know the answer to that.
Is there any relationship between the kinds of questions you ask to what would happen if you asked them for a large language model?
Yes, that's a great question. So the question was, thank you, I'll repeat. Yeah, does it matter, what is the similarity, what's the difference between the kinds of research question we're asking here versus what large language models do, right? So that's a great question. And I have kind of two non-answers to your question. The first non-answer is that most of the largely available large language models like ChatGPT, for instance, they do have sub-lexical representations, meaning they don't actually represent words like unriziness, let's say, as unriziness. They don't decompose them in the same way. But the way that they represent complex words is not the same way that linguists do. And so that's partially because of engineering decisions. That's partially just kind of functions of the model. And there's been some recent work arguing that you can actually mirror human performance better by comparing large language model results, like by using large language models as an actual model of the human mind, if you analyze words more like linguists do. So there's a computer scientist and computational linguist named Phil Resnick that has a paper that came out last year, basically arguing that if we change large language models to look more like how linguists do things, you actually get better performance. My second non-answer is, especially with the second experiment, I'm really interested in not only processing things that are smaller than words, but units that are bigger than words, right? And I think most large language models and computational approaches to language in general really rely on tokenization, meaning splitting a sentence up into its parts. And I'm kind of becoming drawn to the idea that maybe we're a little bit more holistic than that. Maybe we're not always so interested in the individual parts, but we're interested in like chunks of parts at the same time, kind of like my answer to the question about auditory perception. Yeah, so that's another difference, I think. Yeah.
A couple more for Don.
Sure.
The question is, languages evolve.
Yes.
So what does this say anything about how when an individual encounters a novel word or novel usage of an existing word?
Yeah, so the question was, well, languages obviously evolve, right? So linguists sometimes commit the sin of describing languages as these like kind of static things in the world. And so what happens, when you encounter a new word, or what happens when you learn a new word, let's say? I don't have a whole lot to say about that, but part of the reason why this kind of, especially that first experiment where I talked about complex words, part of the reason why there's a lot of interest in this, in what the brain does in these contexts, is partially motivated by that question. So here's an idea, right? Whenever you hear a word like, let's say, hands, right? Like the plural of the word hand, do you have to take that word hands, split it into two parts, remember that hand means this thing and z means plural, and then put them back together and then why bother going through all that process, especially when people use the word hands probably more often than they use the singular, right? Maybe it's more efficient to store that complex word as a whole unit, right? Or maybe now that you've encountered the expression unriziness, if you hadn't heard it before, which I hadn't, right? Maybe now you store that in long-term memory, like why wouldn't you, right? And so there's a debate, actually. There's a lot of interest in, do we think that we always have to split words into their parts? Or is it more efficient? Is the mind and the brain designed to kind of continuously store in long-term memory new expressions, both simple and complex? And that's not really a great answer to your question, but it speaks to the heart of part of the reason why people are really interested in this question about complex words, right? Because you can imagine once you've heard an expression like unrisidus or whatever it is, you store that in long-term memory, and then you don't need to go through all these steps the next time you hear it. Yeah.
How about one last one from the library?
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a relative that is substantially dyslexic. And I couldn't help but wonder whether or not your research gives any clues as to what process in the brain isn't working right.
Yes, that's a great question. So the question was, does this line of research help us basically understand what's happening with dyslexia? And that's also an area of research that's super exciting. What I'll say is that what I presented today doesn't, but it doesn't, but it's not irrelevant. And let me explain what I mean by that. So one of the theories of one of the kinds of dyslexia, so there's different kinds of dyslexia, but one of the theories of one of the kinds of dyslexia is it's a failure to kind of process groups of letters at the same time. That's one of the ideas. And so that actually does make predictions for not anything I've talked about here, but it makes predictions for maybe people's capacity to notice, let's go back to English here, to notice that remake has two parts, R-E-M-A-K-E, right? And so the brain area that is good at noticing groups of letters that kind of co-occur together, this is an area of the brain that's called the visual word form area. That's kind of a technical term. And we do know that people with some forms of dyslexia do show different patterns of activity there. And we also know that even like structural images of the visual word form area in children can predict their capacity to, predicts whether they become dyslexic later in life. So it's that first stage of the process where we do see some interesting answers to the question that you asked about differences between people with dyslexia and people without.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Dustin.
Thank you. I really think this is a lot of fun.